Hello everyone, and welcome to my first tutorial of the year. Today I have another Lolita dress tutorial, and this one was heavily inspired by a dress made by Atelier Boz. They do have quite a few different versions of this dress in various colors. I realized I had the perfect pattern that I just needed to modify a few pieces of to get this same exact look. For this dress, I'm going to be using the McCall's 6800. The amount of fabric I used is a little more than what I had used on the pattern, and I am using cotton, so I did pre-wash my fabric to accommodate for the shrinking. I will be doing view C. And just a side note before we get started, since I self-drafted and modified some of the pieces myself, some of the video will show different parts of the dress put together at different times. But as long as you focus what I'm speaking of in the video, it shouldn't be too confusing on what you're supposed to do at that time. So the first thing I noticed with this pattern was the sleeves were extremely long. And since this pattern comes with a petite size, we're going to adjust the pattern piece to fit my shorter arms a lot better. So on most of the pattern pieces, it has these three lines: the petite line, the fold line, and the shorten and lengthen line. So all you're going to do is take the shorten and lengthen line and fold it up to meet the petite line. Line it up as best as you can and tape it down. I'm also going to do the one at the bottom of the sleeve as well. If you are adjusting the sleeves, make sure you do it to both sleeve pieces. The dress also has these adjustments on the pieces. So if you find the dress still too long for you, you can use this process to shorten the dress as well. For the waist ties, taking my fabric folded in half, you're going to cut out 4 3-inch wide strips. From here, I'm going to turn it the other direction, and I'm going to cut the length to 31.25 inches. This is including the 5/8 inch seam allowance on each end. Then taking your black fabric folded in half, we're going to cut out 8 strips of 5.25 inches wide. And we're going to cut 2 more of the same strip for the sleeve cuffs later on. So for the first modification, I'm going to work on the collar from the pattern itself. So I don't want this to be too high, so I'm going to measure down 1.75 inches from the top of the collar. From here, it'll make a smaller rectangle, and then on the front end of the collar, I'm going to make a small curve from the bottom towards the top, ending right about where the center front is. So the other side is going to be your center back, and that's going to be your center fold. So this will be our new pattern piece for our collar. Once all your pieces are cut out, you're going to go through each one and mark all of the dots and the notches on each piece. Grab your iron, and we're going to apply the interfacing to both of your number 2 front pieces. The wrong side of one of your collar pieces, and to the wrong side to one of the dramatic collar pieces. Setting those aside, we're going to work on our waist ties. Start by laying 2 of your waist ties right sides together, making sure if you're using a directional print, they're both facing the same direction. Then you're going to lay 2 of the waist ties on top of the other 2 waist ties, making sure your directional print is going the same way again. So we're going to cut off some of the corner to make a nice decorative pointed end. So all you're going to do is subtract 2 inches from the edge on one side, and then take a ruler and make a line going from the top corner to the mark that you've made. Then you can cut along this line. Open up the 2 waist ties sections, and we're going to sew both long ends and the diagonal side with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Snip off the corners of your sharp points, making sure not to cut too close to the thread. And then I'm just going to cut off half of the seam allowance on that diagonal edge. Then go ahead and flip these out. Make sure to roll out the seams so the edges of your waist ties are nice and neat, and then go ahead and press them in place. We're going to top stitch all three of the same sides with the 1/16 inch seam allowance. Starting with the two of our front pieces, I'm using my pattern and I'm just going to mark where the waistline is. So a 3/8 inch seam allowance from the top to the waistline that you've marked. Continuing assembling the front, you're going to grab your number 3 middle front pieces, and we're going to lay these right sides together. Since it's a very dramatic curve on the top, you're going to pin in small sections, almost forcefully moving the fabric to where you want it to go to line up both edges of both pieces together. Try not to stretch your fabric too much, but if you're very firm with it, it should curve around the way you want it to. Go ahead and pin all the way down the side, and then do the same thing to the other piece as well. Open these up, and then we're going to lay our number 4 side front pieces right sides together as well. These also have a curve, so you're going to continue to do the same technique. We're going to move on to our number 6 back piece. Open them up, and then you're going to lay them right sides together. Go ahead and pin all the way down the straighter edge. Open this up, and then we're going to attach the number 7 middle back pieces with right sides together. Open these up, and then we're going to add the number 8 side back pieces right sides together. Once again, we're going to open these up, and then we're going to grab our waist ties. So you want to make sure when you lay your waist tie down that your diagonal point is facing the right way. And originally I pinned this right in the middle of that curve, but at the end I wish I put it about 1 inch to 1.5 inches higher. I just felt like it was a little too low for my natural waist. Go ahead and do the same thing to the other strap, making sure that the diagonal edge is facing toward the bottom of the skirt. I'm just going to fold this in half and line it up where my other waistband is pinned on. Moving your waist ties out of the way, take both of the front sections that we've pinned together earlier, and you're going to lay them right sides together with your back section. Then we can pin these sides together as well. We're going to sew each seam together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once it's sewn up, we're going to put some clips in all of the curves, and I'm just making little triangles, making sure not to cut past the thread. This is going to help those curves lay a bit nicer. So go ahead and do this to every seam allowance that needs it. I'm going to clean up the bottom of my skirt by trimming off some of the excess fabric to make sure that curve is even. taking your iron, we're going to iron open all of the seams. Close your dress back up with right sides together, and then go ahead and match the shoulders. Sew these with the 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then you can iron them open as well. Moving on to the neckline, we're going to do a stay stitch of a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then laying this out as straight as you can, we're going to grab our modified collar piece from the pattern, and you're going to line up the long straight edge with the neckline edge with right sides together. Make sure you're using the piece with the inner facing. I'm going to pin the sides first and then find the center and match that up with the center back seam. And then from here, I can easily pin this evenly. Sew this on with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once again, add your clips to the seam allowance, and then we're going to iron the seam allowance up toward the collar. Grab the modified collar pieces, and we're going to lay these right sides together. Pin along the short ends and the long curved edge. And then we're going to sew this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Clip off your corners and any excess fabric around them. That way we get a nice sharp point when we turn it out. When you turn out your collar, you can use a pencil or a chopstick to poke out those corners so they're nice and sharp. And then just like the waist ties, you're going to roll out the fabric at the seams so that they are nice and neat, and then you can iron them in place. Lay the collar of your dress right side up, and we're going to line up the center of the short edge of our dramatic collar with the center back of the collar on the dress. The inner facing on the dramatic collar should be on top. And from here you can pin this down. And then we're going to sew these together with the 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then once it's sewn on, go ahead and make your clips. Moving on to our upper sleeve, we're going to do a 3/8 inch stay stitch between those two center dots. We are going to do a gathering base stitch around the 3 small dots at the top, going from one outside dot to the other. Start with a tail of 3 to 4 inches of thread, and we're going to do a base stitch of a 1/16 inch seam allowance. Leave a 3 to 4 inch tail of thread at the end, and then do the same thing at a 3/8 inch seam allowance, leaving your tail of thread at the beginning and end as well. Take your under sleeve and lay them right sides together with your upper sleeve, matching one edge and pinning it down, and then matching the other edge and pinning that down. Sew these 4 edges with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron open these seams. Going back to our dress turned inside out, going to the sleeve holes, you'll notice that one side has 2 notches and the other has 1. Take your sleeve and turn it right side out. Match the notches on the sleeve to the notches on the sleeve hole. Tuck your sleeve inside, and starting at the bottom, match the notches and the dots. and then grabbing the two top threads, gently pull to gather the top of the sleeve. You shouldn't have to gather too much. You just want to gather it enough to match the opening of the sleeve hole. Then you can match the dots on your sleeve with the dots around the armhole. Gather them up to match, and then adjust your gathers. Make sure that they're all evenly distributed along the top, and you can pin this all in place. Do the same thing to the other sleeve. Sew these on with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once again, add your clips to the seam allowance all around the armholes. At the bottom of our sleeve, match up the seams, and you're going to mark the center of the upper sleeve. Go ahead and measure all the way around the sleeve opening, and for my size 18 that I'm doing, mine is 13.25 inches. Now we can work on the sleeve cuffs. So kind of like the waist ties, we're going to cut another diagonal. I'm going to add 1.25 inches to the measurement of my sleeve opening for the seam allowance, and that will be my length. This time I'm going to add 2 inches to the top of my sleeve cuff. So starting at the bottom from my 14.5 inch length, I'm going to take my ruler and draw a diagonal line to the new mark that I've made. And then I will cut along this line. So you want to make sure you have 4 pieces in total. And then I'm just going to use these pieces as a pattern and cut out 2 of the same piece in the interfacing. Take 2 opposite sleeve cuffs and iron your interfacing onto the back of each. Then take the remaining 2 pieces and lay them right sides together on each one. Sew your 2 short ends and your longest straight edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Again, we will clip off our corners, and then I'm also going to clip off half of the seam allowances on each edge that we sewed. Flip them inside out. Lay out the seams nice and neat and press them down with your iron. Sew the top opening of these cuffs with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Going back to the sleeve on our dress, I'm going to line up the straight edge of my cuff with the line that I've marked from earlier. And lining up the raw edges, I'm going to pin this all the way around. The point of the cuff should be facing toward the back of your dress. Then go ahead and do the opposite to your other sleeve. So this is what they'll look like if done correctly. And we're going to sew these on with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Open up the cuffs and you're going to make sure that the seam allowance is tucked in toward your dress. I'm going to take my iron and press these in place all the way around. And then I'm going to top stitch over the seam with a 1/16 inch seam allowance to hold it in place. Grab the 8 strips and we're going to start working on our skirt trim. Taking 4 of your strips, open them up and start laying them right sides together, pinning the short ends. We're going to sew these ends with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. And you're going to do the same thing to the other 4 strips. Iron all the seams of your strips open. And then we're going to take both of these long strips and lay these right sides together. Match up the seams and you're going to pin one side evenly together. Sew this side with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Fold this in half with wrong sides together and we're going to iron this seam down. Go ahead and put this aside and we're going to grab all of our lining pieces. And we're basically going to sew this together the same exact way. Make sure to make all your clips on the curves and iron open all of your seams. Lay your dress and your lining right sides together. And we're first going to match up the collar. So tuck the dramatic collar in and you're going to line up the top edge of the modified collar from the pattern. And pin this together. Then we're going to match up both of the sides of each dress and pin these together as well, from the top all the way to the bottom. We're going to sew the one edge across the top of the collar and down the other edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to take a little bit more off those curves on the modified collar from our pattern. And then we'll turn this right side out and you can use a pencil or chopstick to poke out the ends of that collar. On the sides of the dress, once again, I'm going to lay out that seam allowance nicely and then press it with my iron. Do this to the other side as well. Moving to the sleeve lining, I'm going to grab my ruler and I'm going to make a mark 5/8 inches from the edge all the way around on both sleeves. And then tuck the edge of the sleeve into the lining and iron it down all the way around. Now we can tuck the lining sleeve into the dress sleeve. Line up your sleeve seam allowances and we're going to pin those together, matching the folded edge of the lining along the thread from the seam allowance of our cuff. Pin this all the way around and on the other side as well. And we're going to slip stitch this closed. I will leave a video down below showing you how this is done if you don't know how. Once again, we're going to take our ruler and at the bottom of our dress lining, I'm once again going to mark my 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way across. Then I'm going to fold it up where I marked and iron this down. Taking the skirt trim, I'm only sewing this on to the outside of the skirt. So I'm going to leave about a 5/8 inch hangover from my blue fabric. I'm going to start lining the raw edges up with the bottom of my dress. And I'm going to pin this down all the way to the other side. And once again, I will leave a 5/8 inch hangover. Going back to the first end, I'm going to remove a few pins and I'm going to flip my skirt trim inside out so right sides are faced together, and I'm going to match that short edge and pin it together. Then I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. If you have excess fabric more than the 5/8 inch seam allowance, you can go ahead and cut that off now. Sew this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Flip off the corner and then turn it back right side out. Then we will repin this down to our dress, and that short edge should match perfectly with the edge of the front of our dress. Sew on the trim with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Go through and make clips all along the curve of your seam allowance. And then we're going to iron the seam allowance up toward your dress. Lay your lining back over neatly, making sure that edge is folded over nicely. And then go through and pin your lining, matching the seam allowances with the dress. From here you can go back and it makes it a little easier to evenly pin down your lining. So there's two ways to sew this together. You can either really go through and make sure that everything is lined out evenly and then do a slip stitch all the way across to close this up. Or you can do like I did, and I made sure that the fold of my lining goes a little bit past that top seam allowance on my trim, and then I'm going to do a stitch in the ditch, which is basically in that little gap between my dress and my trim all the way across. The final thing left to do is to add buttons. So the way I lined out my buttons is I put my first one right in the middle of my collar, which will be one of the smaller buttons. And then I marked 3 inches up from my trim at the bottom for my 1 inch buttons. I marked 1.5 inches from the top of my collar. For the first button, I measured the distance and divided by 7, which left me with 4 inches apart. For the cuffs, I just kind of eyed where I wanted the hole to go, and you're going to put the hole on the pointed side. Go ahead and sew on your buttonholes. I will also leave another video link down below that shows you how to make buttonholes if you don't know how to do that as well. Take your seam ripper and slowly open up each buttonhole. And then folding my skirt over with the buttonholes on top, I kind of marked where I wanted the first one to go, and from there, I used the same measurements I used the first time to mark where I'm going to sew on my buttons. The other 2 small buttons will go on the cuffs. Last but not least is the ribbon, and this you can just place around the neck and measure out how long you want these to be. I cut mine at 1 5/8 yards. and then you're going to use a lighter to burn the ends a little bit, that way they don't fray apart. Place these around the collar and tie a nice bow, and your new dress is complete. I definitely made mistakes with this dress, and I had to do every modification I made over at least 2 or 3 times. To me, it's not perfect. There are a few things like the dramatic collar and the waist ties that I would still really like to adjust a little more. So I highly recommend making a test mock-up first to make sure it's what you like, and you can adjust from there. But at least I'm able to provide at least a base for you to work off of. It's been a while since I've really challenged myself and gone somewhat outside of the pattern, so I really can't be too hard on myself, because in the end I'm still learning, and my goal for my channel was to do things like this so we can kind of all learn from each other. Hopefully this gives you an idea to look at patterns, and you can see that just making a couple little changes will completely change the look to something that maybe you're trying to go for. If you're into Lolita, I hope this was a good find for you to make yourself a new dress, because I know those Lolita fashion patterns are very difficult to find as well as understand. So this McCall's pattern is a really great alternative. I have a lot of great things coming soon, so please subscribe and ring the bell so you get my notifications when I upload, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Bye!